The rain drummed steadily against the window pane, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the heaviness in my chest. Outside, the world moved on. Cars splashed through puddles, people hurried with umbrellas, their faces obscured by the grayness of the day. Inside, I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the floor as though it might hold some hidden answer, some escape from the weight I had been carrying for years. I used to think depression was just sadness, that it was something you could shake off with enough willpower or the right distraction. But by the time I hit my 30s, I understood it was so much more than that. It was a silent battle, one that stole the color from the world and replaced it with shades of gray. It crept into every corner of my life, my work, my relationships, my sense of self, until I barely recognized the person staring back at me in the mirror. I wasn't always like this. In my 20s, life had felt wide open, full of possibilities. I was ambitious, optimistic, and ready to take on the world. Friends often joked about my boundless energy, the way I could juggle a dozen things at once and still have time to show up for everyone around me. But somewhere along the way, that energy began to wane. Little by little, it felt like the spark I once had was flickering out, and I didn't know how to reignite it. At first, I thought it was just burnout. I told myself it was normal to feel tired after years of pushing so hard. Everyone feels this way, I'd whisper to myself late at night, staring at the ceiling when sleep refused to come. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was an emptiness inside me, a hollow space that no amount of work, socializing, or distractions could fill. I started withdrawing without even realizing it. Phone calls went unanswered, plans with friends were quietly canceled, and my once lively social life dwindled to occasional check-ins from people wondering why they hadn't heard from me. I'd been busy, I'd lie, forcing a smile that never quite reached my eyes. The truth was, I wasn't busy, I was drowning. The hardest part was how invisible it all felt. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. I still went to work, still managed to smile and make small talk when needed. But inside, it was a constant storm. Every task, no matter how small, felt insurmountable. Even getting out of bed in the morning was a battle, one that often left me feeling defeated before the day had even begun. I remember one day in particular, sitting at my desk at work. My inbox was overflowing, deadlines loomed, and my boss was asking for updates I didn't have the energy to give. My hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen, as the familiar wave of hopelessness washed over me. My chest felt tight, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I might cry right there in the middle of the office. But instead, I swallowed it down, forcing myself to breathe as I plastered on the mask I'd gotten so good at wearing. "Are you okay?" a coworker asked, their voice kind but laced with concern. I nodded quickly, avoiding their gaze. "Yeah, just tired," I mumbled, hoping they wouldn't press further. They didn't. Most people didn't. It was easier that way, I told myself. Easier to keep pretending, to avoid the awkwardness of explaining something I barely understood myself. But the pretending came at a cost. The more I bottled everything up, the heavier it became. Nights were the worst hours spent lying awake, replaying every mistake, every failure, every reason I felt like I was falling short. My mind was relentless, a constant stream of self-criticism that left no room for peace. "Why can't you just get it together?" I'd think, berating myself for not being stronger, for not being better. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday morning. The sun was shining, birds chirped outside my window, and the world seemed at peace. But I wasn't. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, unable to focus on the show playing in front of me. My chest felt heavy, my thoughts a tangled mess. And then, out of nowhere, a single thought surfaced. What if it never gets better? The weight of that question hit me like a freight train, leaving me breathless. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to climb out of the hole I was in, didn't know if I even had the strength to try. All I knew was that I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. It was in that moment, sitting alone in my living room with the morning sunlight streaming in, that I realized I needed help. Real help, not the half-hearted attempts I'd made in the past, like reading self-help books or trying to think positive. I needed to face this head-on, to stop pretending I could do it alone. The decision to reach out wasn't easy. The stigma surrounding mental health, especially for someone in their 30s who was supposed to have it all together, weighed heavily on me. But the alternative, continuing to struggle in silence, was no longer an option. I picked up my phone, my hands trembling as I searched for a therapist in my area. The first call went to voicemail, as did the second and third. With each unanswered call, my resolve wavered, the voice in my head urging me to give up. But I didn't. I kept dialing, kept leaving messages, until finally someone picked up. "Hello?" the voice on the other end said, warm and reassuring. For a moment, I couldn't speak, my throat tight with emotion. But then, in a shaky voice, I said the words that had felt impossible for so long: "I think I need help." Those 4 words were the beginning of a journey I never expected to take, a journey filled with challenges, setbacks, and moments of profound self-discovery. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But it was also the most important. And yet, even as I began to take those first steps toward healing, I couldn't have imagined where the path would lead me, or the lessons I would learn along the way. The rain outside had stopped, the gray clouds giving way to a tentative patch of blue. But inside, the storm was just beginning to calm. As I hung up the phone and sat back on the couch, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, and far from certain. But it was there, and for the first time in years, it felt like enough. The phone call lingered in my mind long after it ended. I sat there, staring at the now silent device, wondering if I had done the right thing. The thought of opening up to a stranger about everything I had been holding inside was terrifying. I wasn't even sure where to begin or how to put it into words. Would they understand? Would they judge me? The questions swirled around my head like an unrelenting storm. The days leading up to my first appointment passed in a haze. I went through the motions of my routine, but everything felt distant, like I was watching my life from the outside. Work was the same grind it always was: emails, meetings, and deadlines, but it all felt strangely detached. I found myself zoning out more often, staring blankly at my computer screen until someone's voice or an urgent ping snapped me back to reality. At home, the silence was deafening. I had always been someone who needed noise, whether it was music playing softly in the background or the hum of a TV show I wasn't really watching. But now, even those things felt overwhelming. The quiet seemed safer, even though it gave my thoughts more room to wander. And wander they did, back to the same questions that had haunted me for years: how did I end up here? When did it all start to go wrong? The truth was, there wasn't a single moment I could point to. It wasn't like a light switch had flipped, plunging me into darkness. It was more like a slow fade, so gradual that I hadn't noticed it at first. Looking back, I could see the signs: the times I had felt inexplicably tired or unmotivated, the way I had started pulling away from people without really meaning to. But in the moment, it had all felt so normal, so easy to brush off as just a rough patch. I thought about my childhood, about how carefree and simple life had seemed back then. Summers spent riding bikes with friends, evenings filled with laughter around the dinner table. Back then, I believed the world was full of endless possibilities. I believed in myself. Somewhere along the way, that belief had eroded, chipped away by years of setbacks, disappointments, and the quiet, unspoken pressure to be someone I wasn't sure I could be. By the time my 20s rolled around, I was running on ambition and adrenaline. I threw myself into everything: school, work, relationships, with the kind of intensity that made people admire me. "You're unstoppable," they'd say, and I'd smile, soaking in their praise like it was the validation I needed to keep going. But deep down, I knew I wasn't unstoppable. I was just afraid to stop. Stopping meant facing the doubts that lingered at the edges of my mind, the ones that whispered I wasn't enough, that I'd never be enough. So I kept moving, kept chasing goals and ticking boxes, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I'd outrun those thoughts. But no matter how fast I ran, they always caught up with me. The memory of one particular day stood out, a day that should have been a triumph, but ended up feeling like a hollow victory. I had just received a promotion at work, something I had been working toward for years. My coworkers celebrated with me, clapping me on the back and raising their glasses in a toast. But as I stood there, smiling and pretending to be happy, all I could think about was how empty it felt. I had reached the goal I had set for myself, but instead of feeling proud or fulfilled, I felt like an imposter. Like any minute, someone would realize I didn't belong there. That feeling of being an imposter had followed me ever since, casting a shadow over every achievement, every success. It was one of the reasons I had started withdrawing from people. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? How could I tell the people who believed in me that I didn't believe in myself? As the day of my first therapy session approached, the anxiety grew. I replayed the call in my mind, wondering if I had sounded desperate or awkward. Would they think I was wasting their time? What if I couldn't even get the words out when I got there? The questions were relentless, feeding the pit of worry in my stomach. When the day finally arrived, I found myself pacing the small waiting room, my heart pounding in my chest. The receptionist had been kind, her smile warm as she handed me a clipboard of paperwork to fill out. But the questions on the forms felt overwhelming, questions about my mood, my sleep, my relationships. I hesitated, unsure of how honest to be. Did they really need to know everything? By the time I was called back to the office, I was a bundle of nerves. The therapist, a calm and steady presence, greeted me with a gentle smile and gestured for me to sit. The room was cozy, with soft lighting and a few plants scattered around. It was nothing like the sterile, clinical space I had imagined. But even so, I felt exposed, like every insecurity I had been hiding was on display. The first few minutes were awkward, filled with small talk and basic questions. I answered hesitantly, my words carefully measured. But then, something shifted. The therapist asked a question, a simple, open-ended question, and for the first time, I felt a crack in the wall I had built around myself. "What's been the hardest part for you?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. My throat tightened, and my eyes stung with the threat of tears. But instead of pushing the feeling away, I let it come. I took a shaky breath and started talking, the words tumbling out in a rush. At first, it felt like I was speaking in fragments, jumping from one thought to another without much coherence. But the therapist listened patiently, nodding occasionally and offering gentle encouragement. As I talked, I began to notice patterns, moments in my life where I had ignored my feelings, where I had pushed through pain instead of addressing it. By the end of the session, I felt drained but lighter, as though I had taken the first step towards something I couldn't quite name. The therapist didn't have all the answers, no magic solution to make everything better. But they gave me something I hadn't expected, a sense of being seen, of being heard. Still, as I walked out of the office and into the crisp evening air, I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There were no quick fixes, no shortcuts to healing. And part of me was terrified of what I might uncover along the way. As I drove home, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, a new thought began to take shape in my mind. It wasn't hope, exactly, but it was close. It was the idea that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I had always believed. But as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, the familiar heaviness crept back in. The house was dark and quiet, a reminder of how isolated I had become. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, as the tension in my chest began to build again. I knew this was just the beginning, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges I couldn't yet see. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had taken a step forward, however small. And as I opened the door and stepped into the stillness of my home, I couldn't help but wonder what comes next. The days after my first session were harder than I expected. I thought talking to someone would bring relief, but instead, it felt like everything I had been holding back had surfaced all at once. It was as if opening that door had let out a flood of emotions I wasn't ready to face. I found myself questioning if I had made a mistake, wondering if it would have been easier to keep everything bottled up. The nights were the worst. Sleep had always been an escape for me, a brief reprieve from the thoughts that weighed me down. But now, my mind refused to quiet. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as memories and regrets played on a loop. Things I hadn't thought about in years resurfaced: old arguments, missed opportunities, moments when I felt I had let others down. It was exhausting, and yet I couldn't stop. At work, I struggled to focus. My performance, once a source of pride, began to slip. Deadlines felt impossible to meet, and even the simplest tasks took twice as long. My coworkers noticed the change, their concerned glances lingering longer than usual. One of them, a colleague I had always gotten along with, approached me after a meeting. "You've seemed a little off lately. Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. I forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach my eyes, and assured them I was fine. But as they walked away, the weight of my words hit me. I wasn't fine. And pretending otherwise was becoming harder with each passing day. Back at home, the isolation felt suffocating. I thought about calling someone, a friend, a family member, but every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. What would I even say? The fear of being a burden stopped me before I could dial. Instead, I turned to the one thing that had always been my solace: writing. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen, unsure of where to begin. Writing had always been my way of processing the world, of making sense of the chaos in my mind. But now, even that felt daunting. I started typing anyway, the words hesitant at first but gradually gaining momentum. I wrote about the emptiness, the struggle to connect, the constant battle between wanting to reach out and wanting to retreat. As the words poured out, a strange thing happened. For the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't a solution, but it was a step away to give shape to the feelings I had been avoiding. I realized that part of the struggle was the loneliness, the belief that no one else could understand what I was going through. But as I wrote, I began to wonder, what if I wasn't alone? The next therapy session came faster than I expected, and with it, a mix of dread and anticipation. I didn't know what to say or how to explain the tangle of emotions I had been wrestling with. But when the therapist asked how the week had been, I found myself sharing more than I intended. I talked about the nights spent staring at the ceiling, the moments at work when I felt like I was barely holding it together. I even mentioned the writing, how it had helped me untangle some of the thoughts that had been weighing me down. The therapist listened, their calm presence steadying me as I spoke. "What do you think you're afraid of?" they asked gently. The question lingered in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But then, the answer came, clear and undeniable. "I'm afraid of failing. Of letting people down. Of not being enough." The words hung heavy between us, and as I said them, I felt a wave of vulnerability wash over me. It was the first time I had admitted it out loud, even to myself. Over the next few sessions, we began to unpack those fears. It wasn't easy. Each layer we peeled back revealed more pain, more self-doubt. I talked about the pressure I had felt growing up, the need to excel and be perfect. I talked about the moments when I had fallen short, and how those moments had shaped the way I saw myself. But as we delved deeper, something began to shift. I started to see patterns I hadn't noticed before, connections between my past experiences and the way I handled challenges now. It was unsettling, like seeing a puzzle slowly come together, each piece revealing a part of the picture I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Still, the progress felt fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. There were days when I left the sessions feeling lighter, like I had taken a step forward. But there were also days when it felt like I was moving backward, the weight of everything threatening to pull me under. One evening, after a particularly challenging session, I found myself sitting in the car outside my house, unable to go inside. The silence was deafening, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as the emotions I had been holding back threatened to overwhelm me. For a moment, I considered giving up on therapy, on trying to make things better. It felt like too much, like I was trying to climb a mountain with no end in sight. But then, a memory surfaced, the words of someone who had once believed in me, who had seen something in me I couldn't see in myself. "You're stronger than you think," they had said. The memory brought a flicker of resolve, a tiny spark in the darkness. It wasn't enough to banish the doubts, but it was enough to make me take a deep breath, to open the car door and step out into the night. Inside, the house was as quiet as ever, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't comforting, but it wasn't suffocating either. It was just there, like a blank canvas waiting to be filled. As I sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of the day still heavy on my shoulders, I realized something. The journey I was on wasn't just about healing. It was about rediscovering who I was, about learning to see myself not through the lens of my fears and failures, but through the lens of possibility. But even as that thought took shape, the doubts lingered, their whispers persistent. And as I stared out the window at the darkened street, I couldn't help but wonder, would the spark be enough to keep going, or would the darkness win in the end? Let me know if you'd like this developed further. The days that followed felt like a fragile balancing act. On one hand, there were moments when the weight didn't seem as unbearable, when the flicker of hope from that night in the car pushed me to keep moving forward. On the other hand, the familiar shadows of doubt lingered, ready to consume me at the first sign of weakness. It was as if I were walking a tightrope, unsure of whether I would make it to the other side or fall back into the abyss I had fought so hard to escape. One evening, after another long and draining day at work, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. It wasn't something I did often, the nostalgia usually brought more pain than comfort. But that night, something compelled me to look. The photos started innocently enough, pictures from vacations, gatherings with friends, and random moments that had once made me smile. But as I kept scrolling, I stumbled across a folder I hadn't opened in years. The folder was labeled simply with a date, a timestamp from a period of my life I had tried to forget. My thumb hovered over the screen, a sense of dread building in my chest. I knew what was inside, and yet I couldn't stop myself from opening it. The images that appeared were stark reminders of a time when everything had felt like it was spiraling out of control. They were fragments of a chapter one had buried deep, hoping never to revisit. The photos showed a version of me I barely recognized, smiling on the outside but hollow in the eyes, surrounded by people who had no idea what I was going through. One image, in particular, stopped me cold. It was a picture of me sitting on a bench in a park, looking down at my hands. The memory of that day came rushing back, vivid and raw. It had been one of the lowest points of my life, a day when I had felt so utterly lost that I had seriously considered giving up. I stared at the image, the emotions from that day crashing over me like a tidal wave. How had I forgotten this? How had I allowed myself to push it so far out of my mind that it had become just another file on my phone? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been here before. The despair, the hopelessness, the feeling of being trapped, it wasn't new. It was a pattern, one I had never fully addressed. The next therapy session felt heavier than usual. I debated whether to bring up the photos, unsure if I was ready to face that part of my past. But as the session progressed, the therapist asked a question that cut straight to the heart of what I had been avoiding. What do you think keeps pulling you back into these feelings? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't answer. But then, the words tumbled out, unfiltered and raw. I talked about the photos, the memories they brought back, and the realization that I had been running in circles, caught in a loop I didn't know how to break. The therapist listened, their expression thoughtful but calm. Sometimes, they said, what we think we've buried is still shaping us in ways we don't realize. Facing it can be painful, but it's also the first step toward breaking free. Their words stayed with me long after the session ended. That night, I sat down with my laptop and opened a blank document. I started writing again, this time about the day in the park, about the feelings I had tried so hard to forget. The words came slowly at first, but as I kept typing, they began to flow. It was as if each sentence peeled back another layer, revealing truths I had been too afraid to confront. But just as I started to feel a sense of release, something unexpected happened. My phone buzzed with a notification, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The name on the screen sent a jolt through me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Why were they reaching out now? What could they possibly want after all this time? The message was simple, just a few words. I saw your name the other day. It reminded me of something I think you should know. There was no explanation, no context, just a cryptic note that left me reeling. I debated whether to respond, the memories of our last interaction swirling in my mind. It had been anything but amicable, and the thought of reopening that chapter was almost too much to bear. But curiosity got the better of me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I typed out a reply, my heart pounding in my chest. What do you mean? I sent the message and waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. When their response finally came, it was even more cryptic than the first. There's something you need to know about that time in your life. It's important. The words sent a chill down my spine. What could they possibly mean? I thought I had already faced the worst of it, that I had uncovered all the skeletons in my closet. But their message suggested otherwise, hinting at something I had missed, something that could change everything. The uncertainty was maddening, and as I stared at the screen, a sense of unease settled over me. In that moment, it felt like the tightrope I had been walking on was beginning to unravel. The progress I had made, the fragile hope I had started to build, it all felt like it was slipping away. And yet, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this was something I needed to confront, no matter how painful it might be. As the night stretched on, I found myself caught between fear and determination. The message had opened a door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through, but the thought of leaving it closed felt even more unbearable. I didn't know what was waiting on the other side, but one thing was clear: whatever it was, it had the power to either shatter me or set me free. And as much as I wanted to turn back, I knew there was no avoiding it. The only way forward was through. The messages consumed my thoughts, every word replaying in my mind as if they held the key to everything I had been struggling to understand. I knew I couldn't let it linger, the weight of the unanswered questions was becoming unbearable. So, with a mix of anxiety and resolve, I decided to call. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number, each ring feeling like it stretched time further. When they finally picked up, their voice was cautious, unsure, just as I was. They started by apologizing. It was unexpected, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The voice on the other end explained how they had been holding on to something for years, something they felt I needed to know but hadn't had the courage to tell me. They spoke about that time in my life, the one I had tried so hard to forget. And then they said it: there had been people around me who had seen my struggles but didn't know how to help. They had kept their distance, not out of indifference, but out of fear of saying the wrong thing. One person in particular stood out, they said. Someone I had trusted deeply but had lost contact with during that dark period. According to the voice on the phone, this person had reached out to them recently, desperate to reconnect with me, and they wanted to pass along a message. It was strange, almost surreal, hearing all this after so many years. I asked them for more details, trying to piece together the fragments of what they were telling me. But before they could answer, the line crackled, and the call disconnected. Frustration boiled over as I stared at the screen, the silence in the room suddenly feeling oppressive. I tried calling back, but the number wouldn't go through. It felt as if the answers I had been so close to were slipping away, just out of reach. Determined not to let it end there, I dug through old contacts, searching for the name of the person they had mentioned. When I finally found it, my heart sank. I hadn't spoken to them in years, not since we had drifted apart in the chaos of my struggles. Reaching out now felt like reopening a wound, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. When I sent the message, it was simple, just an acknowledgement, and a hope that they might be willing to talk. Their reply came quicker than I expected, and it was clear they had been waiting for this moment, too. They suggested meeting in person, and though every fiber of my being wanted to retreat, I agreed. We chose a quiet CAF, a neutral ground where the ghosts of the past wouldn't feel so overwhelming. Seeing them again was like confronting a mirror version of myself, a reminder of what I had been through and what I had left behind. We exchanged pleasantries at first, awkward and tentative, before diving into the real reason we were there. They explained how they had noticed my struggles all those years ago but didn't know how to help. They admitted their fear, their guilt, and how they had carried it with them ever since. And then they told me the truth, the twist I never saw coming. During one of my darkest times, they had tried to intervene. They had reached out to someone in my life who they believed could help, someone I had always viewed as distant and unapproachable. But instead of helping, that person had dismissed them, saying I was handling things just fine. They had trusted that response, assuming it was better not to push further, but now they realized how wrong they had been. The revelation hit me like a tidal wave. Someone I had trusted, someone I had relied on, had chosen to ignore the signs. It wasn't just neglect, it felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. My initial reaction was anger, a burning need to confront that person and demand answers. But as the conversation continued, my emotions shifted. The friend sitting across from me wasn't trying to hurt me, they were seeking closure, just as much as I was. Their guilt was genuine, and their remorse was palpable. In that moment, I realized that holding on to anger wouldn't change the past. The people who had let me down, who had chosen inaction over compassion, they were part of my story, but they didn't define it. What mattered now was how I chose to move forward. The friend's voice broke as they apologized, tears streaming down their face. I reached out, taking their hand, and told them something I hadn't fully believed until that moment: it's not your fault. We were all just doing the best we could. As we left the CAF, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. But the journey wasn't over. There was still one more thing I needed to do. The next day, I wrote a letter to the person who had ignored my struggles. I didn't know if I would ever send it, but writing it felt necessary. In the letter, I poured out my feelings, the hurt, the disappointment, but also the understanding that they, too, had likely been struggling in their own way. The final twist came when I found an old journal buried in a drawer that evening. Flipping through its pages, I discovered entries from the very time I had been trying so hard to forget. They were raw and unfiltered, filled with pain but also glimmers of hope. One entry, in particular, stood out. It was a letter I had written to myself, a promise to keep fighting, no matter how hard it got. Reading those words felt like a message from my past self, a reminder of the strength I had carried even when I thought it was gone. The story wasn't about the people who had failed me or the moments when I had felt lost. It was about the resilience I had found within myself, the determination to keep going even when everything felt impossible. As I closed the journal, I knew that my battle with depression wasn't over, it never would be. But I also knew that I wasn't the same person I had been back then. I had faced my demons, uncovered truths I hadn't wanted to see, and come out stronger for it. And while the scars of those years would always be a part of me, they no longer defined me. They were a testament to the battles I had fought and the strength I had found along the way. After that night with the journal, something shifted within me. It wasn't an epiphany or a miraculous cure for the struggles I had faced. It was quieter than that, a steady, growing understanding that I had survived what felt impossible. I had confronted truths I had buried deep, faced the people and memories I had once avoided, and through it all, I had managed to stay standing. I decided to send the letter. Not because I needed an apology or expected anything to change, but because I wanted closure. I mailed it without overthinking, letting go of any expectations about how it might be received. The act of sending it was enough. It felt like drawing a line under the past, acknowledging the pain but also refusing to let it define my future. Days turned into weeks, and life started to feel less heavy. My routines remained simple, taking walks, journaling, and occasionally catching up with the friend I had reconnected with. We didn't talk about the past all the time. Instead, we focused on rebuilding a relationship based on understanding and mutual support. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. We were both healing in our own ways, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. One afternoon, I received a response to my letter. It was handwritten, the shaky penmanship reflecting someone grappling with their own emotions. They admitted they hadn't known what to do back then, that they had convinced themselves ignoring the problem was the best way to avoid making things worse. They expressed regret and hoped I could forgive them, not for their sake, but for mine. I read the letter twice, then put it away in a drawer. I didn't feel the need to reply. Their words didn't erase the hurt, but they didn't need to. I had already made peace with what had happened, and their acknowledgement felt like the final piece of a puzzle I had been trying to solve for years. It wasn't closure in the way I'd imagined, it was better. It was freedom. The months that followed weren't perfect, but they were different. I learned to recognize the signs of my own struggles earlier, to be kinder to myself when things felt overwhelming. I sought help when I needed it, no longer ashamed of reaching out to a therapist or leaning on the few close people I trusted. What surprised me most was how those small acts of self-compassion began to add up, creating a foundation I hadn't realized I was building. There was one more step I felt I needed to take. I wanted to share my story, not just with those who had been part of it, but with others who might feel as lost as I once did. At first, the idea terrified me. What if people judged me? What if they didn't understand? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't about their reactions. It was about giving a voice to the silence I had lived in for so long, about showing that it was okay to struggle and that healing, however imperfect, was possible. I started small, writing down my experiences in a way that felt honest but not overwhelming. I shared snippets online, hesitantly at first, but the responses were overwhelmingly kind. People reached out, sharing their own stories or simply thanking me for putting words to feelings they hadn't been able to express. It was humbling and healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time, I felt like my pain had a purpose beyond just surviving it. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from someone who had stumbled across my posts during a rough time in their life. They said reading my story had made them feel less alone, had given them the courage to reach out for help. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was profound. Knowing that my journey, with all its flaws and messiness, had helped someone else, that was worth everything. As time passed, I continued sharing, but I also made space for other things. I explored hobbies I had long neglected, reconnected with family members I had distanced myself from, and even started volunteering at a local organization focused on mental health awareness. It wasn't about fixing others, it was about being part of a community that understood what it meant to struggle and still choose to move forward. Looking back now, I can see the journey for what it truly was: not a straight path, but a winding one with detours, setbacks, and unexpected moments of clarity. I don't think there's a neat resolution to something like this. Healing isn't a destination, it's a process, one that I'm still navigating. But I've learned to appreciate the small victories, to find joy in moments I once took for granted. There are days when the weight of everything still feels like too much, when the shadows of the past creep in and threaten to take over. But those days don't define me anymore. I've built tools, relationships, and an inner strength that I never thought possible. I've learned that it's okay to ask for help, to admit when things aren't okay, and to take life one step at a time. If there's one thing I'd want anyone hearing this to take away, it's this: you're not alone. The silence, the pain, the doubts, they're all part of the human experience, but they don't have to consume you. There's strength in vulnerability, in reaching out, and in finding even the smallest reasons to keep going. As I close this chapter of my story, I'm reminded of the words I once wrote to myself in that old journal. They weren't profound or poetic, but they were true: keep fighting. You're worth it. Those words carried me through my darkest moments, and they're words I hope others can hold on to, too. Because no matter how heavy the struggle feels, there's always light to be found, even in the smallest cracks. And that light, once found, can grow.